In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of Allied advances, millions of German soldiers and civilians found themselves surrendering to American, British, and Soviet forces. Among them were thousands of German women who had served in auxiliary military roles, communications operators, anti-aircraft gunners, nurses, and administrative personnel. These women, who had endured years of rationing, propaganda about Allied barbarism, and the grinding reality of total war, now faced an uncertain future as prisoners of war. What they could not have anticipated was that one of their most disorienting experiences would come not from interrogation or imprisonment, but from the breakfast table. The scene played out in makeshift POW camps across newly liberated Europe. German women, gaunt from months of diminishing rations, lined up for their first American meal. When they received their trays, many stared in confusion at a bowl filled with golden, flake cereal. The substance was dry, light, and utterly foreign. To eyes accustomed to dense black bread and watery potato soup, these crispy flakes resembled nothing edible. Some prisoners assumed it was fodder meant for livestock. Perhaps the Americans were mocking them, or simply ignorant of the difference between human and animal food. Others thought it might be some form of packing material or industrial byproduct, accidentally distributed in the chaos of war's end. The women's hesitation revealed more than simple unfamiliarity with a foreign food. It exposed the vast cultural and economic gulf between wartime Germany and the United States, two nations that had evolved along dramatically different trajectories during the war years. While German civilians had progressively tightened their belts, substituting ersatz coffee made from acorns and stretching every gram of flour, Americans had not only maintained but expanded their industrial food production. The contrast was so stark that when these two worlds collided, the result was mutual incomprehension. This is not merely a story about cornflakes or the peculiarities of military rations. It is a window into the final chapter of World War II, when the abstractions of global conflict became intensely personal. For German POWs, that first bite of an American breakfast cereal represented a confrontation with reality, a reality their government had spent years denying. The Allies were not starving. Their economy had not collapsed. And the lavish propaganda about a decadent, weakened America crumbling under the weight of war was demonstrably false. The evidence sat in a simple bowl, waiting to be tasted. What happened when these women finally took that first bite would become one of countless small moments that defined the war's end, a moment when ideology met reality, and hunger confronted abundance. To understand the shock these German women experienced, one must first grasp the profound differences in how Germany and America experienced the Second World War, particularly regarding food and resources. By 1945, these differences had created two populations living in entirely separate realities. Germany's food situation had been precarious from the beginning. Even before the war, the Nazi regime understood that the nation could not feed itself without massive imports or territorial expansion. This reality drove much of Hitler's eastern expansion strategy. The quest for Lebensraum was partly about securing agricultural land. As the war progressed and Germany's territorial gains reversed, the food situation became increasingly desperate. Rationing, introduced in 1939, grew progressively stricter. By 1945, official rations had fallen to starvation levels, 1,200 calories per day for normal consumers, barely enough to sustain life. The reality for many Germans was even worse than official rations suggested. Supply chains had broken down under Allied bombing. Transportation networks lay in ruins. The women serving in auxiliary military roles often received even less than civilians, particularly as the regime prioritized combat troops. Bread became darker and denser as wheat was increasingly mixed with sawdust, ground peas, and potato starch. Meat was a distant memory for most. Fats were virtually non-existent. The famous German potato, once abundant, had become a luxury item. German women in military service lived this scarcity while also confronting the contradiction of Nazi propaganda. For years, they had been told that America was a soft, materialistic society, weakened by racial mixing and democratic indecision. The propaganda insisted that American soldiers were ill-trained and poorly supplied, that the U.S. industrial capacity was exaggerated, and that Britain and America would soon exhaust themselves. These messages were reinforced constantly through newsreels, radio broadcasts, and military indoctrination. Across the Atlantic, America had experienced the war in an entirely different dimension. While American families certainly faced rationing, sugar, butter, meat, and gasoline were all controlled, the restrictions were mild compared to Europe's suffering. American agricultural production actually increased during the war years. Factories that once produced consumer goods shifted to war materials, but the fundamental abundance remained. Americans might complain about meatless Tuesdays, but they were not starving. This abundance extended directly to the military. American logistical capability became one of the war's decisive factors. U.S. forces were not merely well-armed, they were well-fed. The Quartermaster Corps treated nutrition as a strategic priority, understanding that well-fed soldiers fought better, recovered faster, and maintained higher morale. American rations were designed not just for sustenance but for variety and even pleasure. This included breakfast cereals. Cornflakes, invented in 1894 by John Harvey Kellogg, had become a staple of American breakfast tables by the 1940s. The cereal represented American industrial food processing at its most efficient: corn, processed, toasted, packaged, and shipped worldwide. It was lightweight, shelf-stable, nutritious, and required only milk to prepare. For military logistics, it was ideal. For soldiers and support staff, it was familiar, a taste of home. When American forces established POW camps in 1945, they followed Geneva Convention requirements to feed prisoners adequately. But adequately, by American standards, meant something very different than German survival rations. American military planners, often with little understanding of how severe German deprivation had become, simply extended their own supply systems to cover prisoners. This meant POWs suddenly received rations comparable to what American troops ate. The women who ended up in these camps came from various branches of German military auxiliary services. The Wehrmacht had increasingly mobilized women as the war consumed more men. By 1945, approximately 450,000 German women served in military support roles. They operated anti-aircraft batteries during the defense of the Reich, ran communications networks, worked in military administration, and served as nurses. When their units surrendered or were captured, they became POWs, though their status was sometimes ambiguous. Were they combatants or civilians? Most ended up in camps run by Western allies, where conditions varied but generally followed international law. The women arrived exhausted, often having fled westward to avoid Soviet capture. Many had witnessed combat in Germany's final defense. They came from cities reduced to rubble, having survived on progressively smaller rations as the Reich's infrastructure disintegrated. They expected prison camps to be harsh, possibly brutal. What they did not expect was to confront abundance. The distribution of that first American meal followed a routine that had been repeated thousands of times across dozens of POW facilities. American military police and support staff organized the German women into lines, processed them through makeshift kitchens, and handed them standard-issue metal trays. The Americans, for their part, treated this as unremarkable, just another day feeding prisoners according to regulations. For the German women, however, nothing about this experience was routine. The quantity of food itself was shocking. Where they had grown accustomed to thin soup and a slice of bread, they now received multiple items: the bowl of cornflakes, milk, bread with actual butter or margarine, sometimes coffee made from real coffee beans rather than roasted grain substitute. The sensory experience was overwhelming for people who had lived with deprivation for so long. But it was the cornflakes that provoked the most confusion. The cereal sat in bowls, dry and light, completely unlike any breakfast food in German culinary tradition. German breakfast, when food was available, centered on bread, dark, dense rye bread, perhaps with a bit of butter or lard, maybe some cheese or cold meat in better times. Hot cereal existed in the form of oatmeal or other grain porridges, but these were thick, cooked, and substantial. Dry, flake cereal was completely foreign. The women examined the golden flakes with suspicion. Some picked up individual pieces, turning them over, testing their texture. The lightness suggested something insubstantial, possibly inedible. Several women reported later that their first thought was that this must be animal feed, something meant for chickens or livestock. The idea that humans would eat such a thing seemed absurd. Others wondered if it was some kind of industrial product, perhaps packing material that had been mixed in by mistake. Some refused to eat it entirely, pushing the bowl aside and focusing on the bread, which at least looked like food. Others, driven by hunger that had become their constant companion, decided to taste it despite their doubts. What happened next became a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. The first bite was a revelation. The cornflakes, especially when combined with milk and perhaps a bit of sugar if available, were not animal feed at all. They were sweet, crispy, and surprisingly pleasant. For women whose taste buds had forgotten what sweetness felt like, who had lived on bitter ersatz coffee and bland potato soup, the flavor was almost shocking. The texture, so light and crunchy, was unlike anything in their recent memory. More than that, it was filling. The combination of grain and milk provided actual nutrition, protein and carbohydrates together. As the women ate, they could feel their bodies responding to real food, not the emptied bulk of sawdust-extended bread or watery soup, but actual nourishment. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that they might not see such food again. Others ate quickly, driven by months of hunger. As word spread through the camp, more women tried this strange American cereal. The initial suspicion gave way to curiosity, then to acceptance, and in some cases to something approaching delight. The cornflakes became a topic of conversation, a shared experience that helped break the ice among prisoners from different units, who found themselves thrown together. But the emotional impact went deeper than simple enjoyment of food. For many of these women, the cornflakes represented a cognitive dissonance they struggled to process. They had been told for years that America was weak, that the Allies were barely holding on, that German victory was inevitable despite temporary setbacks. Yet here they were, prisoners, and their captors were feeding them food they themselves had not tasted in years. The abundance was undeniable and impossible to reconcile with the propaganda they had believed. Some women reported feeling shame at their own hunger, at their eagerness to eat enemy food, at the realization that they had been deceived. Others felt relief that the war was over, that they had survived, and that perhaps captivity under the Americans would not be as terrible as they had feared. Still others experienced anger at the contrast between what they had endured and what their captors apparently took for granted. The American guards and support staff, watching these reactions, often did not fully understand what they were witnessing. To them, cornflakes were mundane, perhaps even boring, standard military fare. They saw the German women's initial hesitation and sometimes found it puzzling or amusing. Why would anyone think cornflakes were animal feed? It was a breakfast cereal. Children ate it every day back home. This mutual incomprehension highlighted the vast experiential gap between victors and vanquished. The Americans had fought a war but had not experienced it on their home soil. Their families were safe. Their cities were intact. Their food supply had never been seriously threatened. They could not truly grasp what years of progressive deprivation felt like, or how it altered one's relationship with the most basic necessities. As days turned into weeks in the POW camps, the impact of American rations extended far beyond that first shocking breakfast. The German women found themselves confronting not just cornflakes but an entire system of abundance that challenged everything they had been taught about the war and their enemies. The food kept coming. Breakfast after breakfast, meal after meal, the Americans provided rations that exceeded what these women had eaten in years. There was bread, white bread, made from actual wheat flour, soft and light. There was meat, real meat, not the mysterious ersatz products they had grown accustomed to. There were vegetables, canned but recognizable. There was coffee that actually tasted like coffee. And yes, there were cornflakes, which gradually transformed from a shocking novelty into an accepted part of the routine. This sustained abundance forced a reckoning. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years constructing a narrative about the war and Germany's enemies. America was supposed to be a nation of mongrels and materialists, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for total war. Britain was supposed to be exhausted, barely clinging to survival. The entire Allied war effort was supposedly on the verge of collapse, weakened by strategic bombing, submarine warfare, and the superior will of the German people. Every meal in the POW camp contradicted this narrative. If America was struggling, why were its soldiers, and even its prisoners, eating so well? If the Allied economy was collapsing, where was all this food coming from? The cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. Some women clung to explanations. Perhaps this camp was exceptional. Perhaps they were being given American rations as propaganda. Perhaps the food would run out soon. But as weeks passed, these rationalizations became harder to maintain. The impact went beyond just food. The American Guards, while maintaining military discipline, were not the brutal occupiers German propaganda had predicted. There were no mass executions, no systematic cruelty, no revenge for years of war. Instead, there was bureaucracy, routine, and a certain casual efficiency. The Americans seemed more interested in processing paperwork than in punishment. This, too, contradicted expectations. For some women, this experience catalyzed a broader questioning. If they had been lied to about American weakness and Allied collapse, what else had been false? The promises of wonder weapons that would turn the tide? The assurances that Germany was winning? The fundamental premises of Nazi ideology itself? The cornflakes became a symbol, a tangible piece of evidence that their worldview had been built on falsehoods. Others struggled with this realization. Accepting that they had been deceived meant accepting that the sacrifices, the years of hardship, the losses of friends and family, the destruction of their cities, had been for nothing. It meant confronting complicity in a regime that had led them to disaster. This was psychologically difficult, and some women resisted it, finding other explanations or simply refusing to think about the implications. The camp environment itself shaped these reactions. German POWs, thrown together from different backgrounds and units, shared their experiences and perspectives. Some had been true believers in the Nazi cause, others had been skeptical but silent, still others had privately opposed the regime but had no choice about service. These different viewpoints collided in conversations around meals, in barracks discussions, and the shared experience of captivity. American authorities, aware of the need for denazification, sometimes used film screenings and lectures to confront prisoners with the reality of Nazi crimes, particularly the concentration camps. For the women eating American rations, the juxtaposition was stark. They had been starving while the regime operated an apparatus of systematic murder. They had lacked basic necessities while resources were devoted to genocide. The cornflakes and white bread became part of a larger awakening to the true nature of the system they had served. Not all women underwent dramatic conversions. Human psychology is more complex than simple before and after narratives. Some accepted the food gratefully while maintaining their political beliefs. Others rationalized their service as duty rather than ideology. Still others simply focused on survival, unwilling or unable to engage with larger questions while their own future remained uncertain. But for many, the experience of American captivity, symbolized by that first incredulous encounter with cornflakes, marked a turning point. It was the moment when propaganda met reality, when ideological certainty confronted physical evidence, when the carefully constructed narrative about the war and Germany's enemies finally collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. The story of German women POWs and their reaction to American rations, particularly cornflakes, might seem like a minor footnote in the vast history of World War II. Yet it encapsulates several profound truths about the war's end and its aftermath that deserve deeper consideration. Most of these women were released from POW camps within months of Germany's surrender in May 1945. The Western Allies, particularly the Americans, moved relatively quickly to process and release prisoners who were not suspected of war crimes. The women returned to a Germany that was physically and psychologically devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Families were scattered or destroyed. The economic system had collapsed. And now they faced occupation, denazification, and the challenge of building new lives from the rubble. Many carried their experiences in American captivity as a secret treasure, a memory of a time when they had, paradoxically, eaten better as prisoners than they had as free citizens of the Reich. This memory shaped their understanding of the war and its outcome. They had seen firsthand that Nazi propaganda about American weakness was false. They had experienced the material superiority that had helped the Allies win. And they had learned that the enemy they had been taught to fear had treated them with a measure of decency that contrasted sharply with their own government's behavior. The cornflakes, in particular, became a recurring memory and later a cultural symbol. In the post-war years, as West Germany rebuilt and integrated into the American-led Western Alliance, American consumer culture flooded in. Cornflakes and other American breakfast cereals became available in German stores, no longer a shocking military ration but a mundane consumer choice. For women who remembered their first encounter with these flakes in a POW camp, seeing them on supermarket shelves must have triggered complex emotions, memories of defeat and surrender, but also of survival and awakening. The broader significance of this story lies in what it reveals about the nature of total war and its end. World War II was fought not just on battlefields but in factories, fields, and kitchens. The Allied victory was as much a triumph of logistics and industrial capacity as of military strategy. The ability to feed not only one's own forces but also millions of prisoners and displaced persons demonstrated a level of organizational capability that Germany simply could not match by 1945. This logistical dominance had strategic implications that are sometimes overlooked in narratives focused on battles and generals. Well-fed soldiers fought better, suffered lower disease rates, and maintained higher morale. Prisoners who were adequately fed were less likely to cause problems, more willing to cooperate, and eventually more receptive to re-education efforts. The decision to feed German POWs according to Geneva Convention standards, rather than subjecting them to deliberate starvation, reflected both American values and pragmatic calculation about post-war occupation. The experience of these German women also illuminates the process of denazification and political transformation in post-war Germany. Grand programs of political re-education and legal tribunals played their role, but so did countless small moments of realization, moments when propaganda collided with reality and shattered. The cornflakes were not a tool of psychological warfare, they were simply standard military rations. But their effect on prisoners' understanding was nonetheless profound. This story also reminds us that war is experienced differently by different populations. While American GIs complained about military food and dreamed of home cooking, German women in POW camps were confronting abundance they had not known in years. While Americans viewed cornflakes as boring but adequate military fare, German prisoners saw them as evidence of an almost unimaginable prosperity. The same object carried entirely different meanings depending on one's perspective and experience. In the decades after the war, as the Cold War reshaped global politics and West Germany became a key American ally, these early encounters between German prisoners and American captors took on new significance. The stories of decent treatment, adequate food, and fair handling by American forces helped legitimize the Western alliance in German eyes. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners, many of whom languished in camps for years under brutal conditions, made the American system look even better in retrospect. Today, the story of German women mistaking cornflakes for animal feed survives primarily in oral histories and memoirs. It has become a somewhat humorous anecdote, a tale of cultural misunderstanding and the strange moments that mark war's end. But beneath the surface humor lies a deeper historical truth. The moment when these women took their first bite of American cereal was the moment when one reality replaced another, when the world as they had understood it gave way to a new and different world, built on different premises and different truths. The cornflakes were never just food. They were a message, unintended but unmistakable, about who had won the war and why. They were evidence that the Allied nations, particularly America, had fought the war while maintaining a level of prosperity that Germany could not match. They demonstrated that the Nazi vision of a world order was not merely morally bankrupt but practically impossible, built on lies about both Germany's strength and its enemy's weakness. For the women who took that first uncertain bite in the spring of 1945, the taste was more than just sweet and crispy. It was the taste of truth, bitter and nourishing at once, the truth that they had been deceived, that they had lost, but also that they had survived, and that the future, however uncertain, would be built on realities rather than propaganda. In the end, that single bite represented the beginning of Germany's long journey from total war and totalitarian delusion toward democracy, prosperity, and peace.